Hello everyone, glad you could click in to join this. This is going to be a lecture. It might be broken up into two parts. At this exact time I don't know, but we need to go through two things. We got to get a little bit of digestive system anatomy in so that as we go through the slides, you'll know just where we're talking about in general, what those functions are. So what you're looking at here is kind of a generic man. That is not me. I know, kind of looks like me, but the digestive system, I'm gonna scroll up here, starts anatomically in the mouth, the buccal cavity, as you might also hear it called more formally. You have three pairs or kinds of salivary glands that we'll talk about: sublingual, parotid, submandibular. All these secrete into the saliva of your mouth. Some of those consistently. The sublingual is always secreting saliva into your mouth, and others only when you're eating and or when stimulated. Okay, so obviously after chewing, you swallow, you come to the larynx and the pharynx, and you go down the esophagus. All right, the esophagus is the tube that connects from the mouth to the stomach. The pharynx and larynx are in the throat, where the vocal cords are. As it comes from the esophagus, you can't see it because it's just behind the liver. The liver is the largest internal organ, okay, of the body. The integumentary system, which is the skin, is the largest, but that is external. Of course, it separates us from the outside world. The liver is the largest internal organ. So not everything here is necessarily to scale. So right behind the esophagus, you can kind of see where it terminates into the stomach. Large muscular sac where a lot of churning and moving. It's pretty amazing how you do not feel the stomach moving as much as it does, because it does move and churn and helps to finish off the mechanical digestion of food, where it also kicks in the second part of chemical digestion. All these things we're going to talk about here shortly. From the stomach, you exit through the sphincter into the small intestine, and you have three portions of the small intestine: the duodenum, the ileum, and the jejunum. And then the small intestine unites with the large intestine down here by the appendix, and you have the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and then you come over here into the rectum and the anus. Other accessory organs with digestive system, as we've already mentioned, is the liver, namely more so though the gallbladder to secrete bile into the small intestines. And the gallbladder secretes bile into the small intestines about the same time as the pancreas secretes its juices into the small intestines. So pancreas and gallbladder are accessory organs that also secrete and have a role in chemical digestion. The gallbladder for fats, emulsifies fats, breaks them up into tiny fat droplets instead of big fat droplets that can be circulated and taken into the blood. And then the pancreas secretes some enzymes, pancreatic juices we'll talk about, into the small intestines, where chemical digestion really comes down. So third step in chemical digestion, and it is the most important. It's where most things that have not yet been broken down are broken down. Water is produced and absorbed throughout this process. Whatever water hasn't been absorbed is left into the large intestine. That's what allows our bowel movements to be. Okay, now that we have some anatomy, you can scroll down and look at these things slowly. This is a good outline summary of digestion, and we're going to kind of go through this on the PowerPoint slides right about now. Okay, so I'm going to start this PowerPoint slide. Okay, so digestive and excretory systems. I know it says excretory systems. We're probably not going to talk about that much. That's just the elimination of waste. What we are interested in, though, is digestion, why it is important to nutrition and health. And so just to understand a little better some of that, we want to know a little bit more about the organs, right, that play a role in that. So starting with the oral cavity, teeth, and tongue, that's where we said in the previous slide, digestion begins. However, have you ever thought about when digestion begins. Digestion begins when you start talking about food, when you start hearing others talk about food, when you smell food. Man, I remember fourth period when I was in high school was right before lunch. We had 8 periods in a day, and fourth was right before it. And man, just the mind knowing, one, the tummy is getting a little rumbly. You knew it was 11 o'clock, and so lunch was coming. But not only that, my class was on the 300 wing, which was directly down from the cafeteria. Not that cafeteria food was the best, but coming from my house, I liked it. So, about 30 minutes before the bell rang, that teacher could get nothing done. I so lucked out for a couple years because I had study hall right before lunch, so it didn't really matter. But we would crowd up right at the door, and we would bolt down that hallway to lunch. Digestion had already begun. And what happened is, you have to think back again to the pictures we just saw. The salivary glands began to secrete their juices. Okay, and that's where the whole process begins. So the digestive system functions to convert the food into nutrients that a body's cell can use. So we eat foods, we eat pizza, we eat scrambled eggs, we eat steak, whatever it is, we eat Twinkies. We don't need Twinkie anywhere on our body. We don't need egg anywhere on our body. I don't need a slap of pepperoni here and a slap of pepperoni there. But what we do need are the molecules, the nutrient molecules that make up those food particles. In order to get at those, we got to physically tear and shred those apart. And actually, the physical part of digestion is much easier than the chemical, or quicker anyway. So a lot of the nutrients in those foods are used in what we call metabolism. Those are all the chemical processes of your body. The breaking down of food in order to get energy from it, the building up of other food in order to make new cells, new tissue. The cells you have now are not the same cells you've always had. And if you have any scars on you, you know that new skin has replaced it. And sometimes that scar is there, but how that scar get there? There had to be a rebuilding time. And every day, especially if you're physically active, every day you have micro abrasions in your body and outside your body that are constantly being healed, constantly being replaced and rebuilt with new cells. So you constantly need to eat to repair those cells as well as to provide you energy. All those chemical reactions together are called your metabolism. So other nutrients are used to build new cells. Some are used to give you energy. So digestion is the breaking down of large food molecules into smaller, more usable ones. You might have heard of these referred to as monomers, or subunits of large molecules called polymers or dimers. So a polymer is a large molecule, a monomer is a small one. So digestion is the process of breaking down the stuff we've chewed up and swallowed, is kind of extracting the chemical molecules out of that. So large food molecules must be broken down both physically and chemically. You can think of, how do we break food down physically? I've mentioned 2 ways up to this point. Teeth, that's right. Teeth shredding the food. A lot of saliva and water kind of just surrounding it. Just like water tends to dissolve and break things down, water is mostly in your saliva, and it begins to just make soft and break down, mixing it with the enzymes there that start to work chemically. So when you're like myself right before lunch, or anytime you're out and about, you come out of a store, you smell that grill in the air that some restaurant is releasing out the back of, or top of their building. Smells great. Chemicals are released in your saliva. So as you physically shred the food, salivary amylase is one of the first ones to begin. But physical breakdown of food is called mechanical digestion. So this physical breakdown of food, again, that happens in your teeth, continues in your stomach as your stomach churns. So the mouth has salivary glands, and this is where, again, moistening Some chemical digestion occurs, amylase, and mechanical digestion occurs. Mechanical digestion is chewing or masticating. Okay, salivary glands simply moisten it, and slowly, as you mechanically break down the food, the chemical enzymes can get to those molecules and begin to work on them chemically. Well, let's go back one slide here. This is simply the pathway that we talked about, but I will go ahead and say here in the mouth is where salivary enzymes begin to work on your food chemically, and then in the stomach there's another kind of enzyme, one kind of enzyme that begins to work on protein, and then in your small intestine, that's where all the rest of the food is absorbed or is broken down. Sorry about that. So there's your slides. I got a little ahead of myself in the lecture. So teeth, what do? Mechanical digestion, chewing the food. Saliva contains amylase. Amylase, notice the word ase, A-S-E, you'll see that at the end of many enzymes. So salivary amylase, because there is another kind of amylase, is secreted here, and that begins to work on the sugar monomers. Remember those, I just mentioned large and small molecules? Well, amylase works on starches like in potatoes, apples, and some other, many other. It's the primary starch or carbohydrate that plants make that we eat is amylose, A-M-Y-L-O-S-E. But salivary amylase is the enzyme that breaks down the carbohydrates between the sugar monomers. And so in these starches, which are long polymers, as the amylase breaks down the bonds between them, it releases these sugar monomers, and it's these sugar monomers that your cells need. So that begins way up here in the mouth. Okay, carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth. Esophagus is a tube that goes in from the mouth to the stomach. So mechanical digestion begins in the mouth when food is chewed into small pieces. And as food is chewed, it mixes with the saliva, which begins to work on it chemically. Saliva adds digestive enzymes to food, starting the process of chemical digestion. Saliva also makes food particles easier to swallow, for sure. We don't like swallowing dry things, which is why when you take pills, right, you take it with a swig of water or something. So here's a question. Whoops, this is out of order. Can you swallow food if you're upside down? Well, I have had food come through my nose when I swallowed upside down. It was liquidy. That burnt a little bit. But yes, you can. There's a term called peristalsis. Say that, peristalsis. That's movement in a wave-like contraction. It's like a wave going down as soon as you swallow. Now, you only feel the swallow, but it continues to move just like your swallow all the way down the esophagus, in a form called peristalsis. That's smooth muscle contractions of the esophagus that squeeze food through about 25 centimeters of tubing to the stomach. The stomach then, which is where the food empties into, is a large muscular sac. It actually has 3 layers of muscle. So chemical digestion begins here, but it's not specific. Okay? The kind of digestion that occurs in the stomach, as we mentioned, the stomach churns and moves because of those layers of muscle. We'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. But it also secretes acid, and you've probably heard of hydrochloric acid. Not only that, there's a mucus that lubricates the wall, and so the food becomes more slippery and slimy. The hydrochloric acid kind of activates another enzyme that's there. So there are enzymes in your stomach that are inactive, but once all the hydrogen ions of the acid attach to it, it's like a switch, like a trigger that tells that enzyme, in this case pepsin, to begin breaking down proteins. So again, salivary amylase begins breaking down carbohydrates in the mouth, and now in the stomach, protein digestion begins when pepsin begins working. So I've only listed 2 enzymes for you: amylase for carbohydrates or sugars, and pepsin for proteins begins in the stomach. Now, it doesn't get very far, but it does start the process of unraveling because these are very long and very complex molecules. The acid itself begins to help break down and loosen the bonds that hold food together. So you have water that helps dissolve it. You have the churning physical, mechanical motion. You have the hydrochloric acid, which begins to erode it and cause it to unravel and denature. It means lose its shape, which allows the enzymes like pepsin and amylase to attach those bonds and break them so we can snip the food down bit by bit. This combination of pepsin and hydrochloric acid begins the complex process of protein digestion. So in the small intestine, the duodenum, some like to say duodenum, that's fine. And the duodenum, that's the first part of the small intestine. It's about, I believe, 10 to 12 inches. This is where the majority of food nutrients are broken down and absorbed. All right, there are microvilli in the intestines we'll look at that add surface area, so it's not just a tube, but it's a tube with a lot of ridges on it. So chyme is now what we call the fluid that comes from the stomach. This is the food that's been eaten mixed with all the salivary juice, the stomach acid, the enzymes. I mean, it's like a squirt. It's a thick, or like a pudding consistency probably by this point. And now in the duodenum, the pancreas and liver secrete their enzymes. And now that pancreatic juice or enzymes, there's many of them: lipases, proteases, trypsin, pepsin. These are more enzymes to break down more proteins, lipids, and sugars. So most of the chemical digestion occurs here. So the pancreas, if you recall from our first image, sits just below the stomach. It produces hormones that regulate blood sugar. That's insulin and glucagon. We are not interested in that right now. Those are the hormones of diabetes, as you might recognize them to be. Pancreas secretes those hormones, but what we're interested more in of the pancreas for digestion are the pancreatic juices. We call it pancreatic juice because it's a slew of enzymes. It really is just a slurry of fat digesting enzymes, sugar digesting enzymes, protein digesting. So we have pancreatic amylase, just like we had salivary amylase. There's a pancreatic amylase. We have cholecystokinin, which tells the gallbladder to release its such. So there's a lot of big names here we won't get bogged down with. But bottom line is pancreatic juice has a lot of enzymes that break down the nutrients in our food. Pancreas also produces sodium bicarbonate, and that's a base that neutralizes the stomach acid. The environment in the stomach, because of hydrochloric acid, is very acidic, right? Duh. So once it comes into the small intestine, that's a big jump in the pH. The pH of your stomach is anywhere from 4 at its least acidic time, 1 or 2 during meal times. And the small intestine's pH is anywhere from 7 to 11. That's a humongous jump in pH. And that's due to this sodium bicarbonate. You might be familiar with sodium bicarbonate. It's that stuff you buy and keep in your refrigerator in that yellow box, right? Arm & Hammer, baking soda, things like that. So, neutralizes stomach acids. This brings up the pH, changes the environment. And my slide's not changing. Here we are. Liver is a large organ located above the stomach. It produces bile, a fluid loaded with lipids and salts, and it dissolves droplets of fats so enzymes can reach the fat molecules to break them down. Of the molecules we've talked about, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids are fats, and they are the largest and most, they're not the most complex. That'd probably be the proteins, but they are some of the largest and most difficult because they're so stable. They're difficult to break down. And so it takes a lot of time. As a matter of fact, fats are digested in a way that no other molecule is digested. But it begins right here with bile being secreted from the gallbladder. Empties into it. As we go from the duodenum to the jejunum and ileum, the second and third parts of the small intestines, more of those nutrients that were broken down in the duodenum are now being absorbed. And the whole reason why your small intestine are so long is because it needs For all the food that we eat, it needs that time, that surface area in which to cross. So once you cross the barrier of the small intestines, that tube lining, now it enters into the capillaries in the bloodstream, which are right here in the villi. Folded projections that increase the surface area of the walls in the small intestine. They have blood vessels in them, and those blood vessels pick up the nutrients that have been released by digestion. So millions of tiny finger-like projections called villi line the small intestine. The villi increase the small intestine's surface area, so most nutrients are absorbed by the time they reach the large intestine. This is very important. Surface area, and you need to attach villi to the idea of the surface area. The more surface area there is, the more doorways there are to get into your body. The less villi and the less surface area there is, the less access nutrients have to get into your body. So here's a picture of that. So we're looking in the small intestine. We just picked a section here in the lower abdomen. And when we open that tube up, you notice it's not just a perfectly round, like a water hose with a smooth lining, but you have this kind of what we call rugae or folds. And if we kind of cut along here and laid it out flat, some of you might have eaten this part of the cow or pig before, and so you know just what we're talking about. But this highly folded lining of the small intestine has many in itself. So if we just blew this little portion up with a circle, we'd see that not only does it have this villi, but we have these microvilli. So we're looking really small here now, so we have just magnified the surface area across which nutrients can diffuse and get into our bloodstream. And you can notice right here, here's a capillary. These are the smallest of the blood vessels, practically microscopic. And this is where food then across all these microvilli come in and get picked up by the bloodstream and carried to the rest of our body. Crazy process. Inside each villus are capillaries and tiny lymph vessels, and it is here that nutrients enter the bloodstream. Up to this point, the food has been outside your body. If you took a string and put it down your mouth and pulled it out your anus, you would have one continuous tube of the outside world. It is not until this point right here that food crosses the microvilli and gets into the blood capillaries that the food is now in your body. Large intestine removes water from undigested material that is left. So your body needs water, and you get some water from the digestion of that material. We don't want to absorb all the water because that's impaction, right? And we have a dry, hard stool that's unbearable. But it does remove most of the water. It leaves behind just enough to soften the waste. Rich colonies of bacteria grow on the undigested material left in the colon. These intestinal bacteria help the digestive process. There's much that could be said about this, the bacterial flora of your stomach and the role it plays in your health. The concentrated waste material that remains after the water has been removed passes through the rectum and is eliminated from the body. Speaking of the bacteria, and let's just talk about bad bacteria, and we've had diarrhea. I know, it's a hard truth to live with, but oftentimes that's when a bacteria attaches itself to the intestine, and in order to try to get rid of it, instead of absorbing water the way large intestine are supposed to absorb the water, what they'll end up doing is secrete a lot of water to try to wash off, because your body detects that bacteria that's along the large intestinal wall. And so it's trying to get it off, and that's why there's a lot of water in diarrhea, because that water is being used to try to flush out the bacteria or the virus or whatever it is. It's trying to get rid of it. So it's your body's way of getting rid of the bad bacteria is diarrhea. All right, so the rest of this is the excretory system. So the digestive system has a way of getting rid of solid waste. The excretory system is a way of getting rid of liquid waste. And that is, once these nutrients have been broken down further in your blood and in the cells, oftentimes chemical waste is released back into the blood, and that blood is filtered in kidneys, and the good is kept in the bloodstream and the bad is released as urine. We're not getting into that. You are not responsible, but you do want to understand just that tidbit that I gave you. That waste solution from the kidneys is called urine, and it flows out, and it's once the nutrients themselves have been utilized in the body, there are chemical toxins and waste and nitrates that build up, ammonia that builds up that needs to be gotten rid of. All right, well, thank you for listening. The full 25 minutes here. This is quite a while, and you have much patience. We're back at the beginning here. Have a good day.